Something has been costing you everything: your time, your certainty, your relationships, your sense of who you were supposed to become. And the most dangerous thought you can have in the middle of it is that this means something went wrong. Carl Jung spent decades studying exactly this pattern, not in the abstract, but in real people navigating real collapses, real losses, real years when everything that was supposed to work simply didn't. And what he found, consistently and precisely, was the opposite of what most people fear. The hardest years are not the evidence that the life you were meant to have is slipping away. In the Jungian framework, they are frequently the mechanism by which it arrives. The reward you're imagining isn't waiting on the other side of the difficulty. It is being constructed inside it. Before we go deeper, if this kind of knowledge speaks to you, if you've been looking for a framework that actually explains what you're living through, subscribe to the channel. This is where we keep building this work together. Jung was not a theorist of comfort. He didn't study the psychology of people whose lives were going smoothly. He studied what happened in the interior of human beings when their exterior lives fell apart, when the structures they had organized their identity around collapsed, when the future they had planned became unavailable, when they were left with nothing stable to hold on to. And what he found across decades of clinical work and historical study was a pattern so consistent that he built an entire framework around it. He called it individuation, the process by which a human being becomes, through sustained engagement with the depths of their own psyche, the most complete version of who they actually are. And his central observation about this process was this: it almost never happens in the easy years. It happens in the hard ones. The concept of individuation requires some unpacking, because it is easily misunderstood. It is not self-improvement in the ordinary sense. It is not the achievement of goals, or the development of skills, or the accumulation of success. In Jung's framework, individuation is the progressive realization of the self, not the ego self, the personality that manages daily life, but the self with a capital S, the deeper organizing center of the total psyche that contains more of who you are than the conscious mind can access at any given moment. This self exerts a constant pressure toward its own fuller expression. It presses from the inside, through the structure of your life, toward the situations, relationships, and experiences that will force you to grow beyond what you currently are. And this pressure intensifies, not when life is comfortable and your existing identity is confirmed, but when it is challenged, disrupted, dissolved. What separates suffering that destroys from suffering that transforms is not the intensity of the experience. It's not a question of some people having harder hardships than others. Jung was precise about this distinction. What separates the two is the quality of the relationship the person maintains with what is happening in their interior during the difficulty. The person who treats the hard years purely as external events to be survived, as problems to be solved and gotten past as quickly as possible, tends to emerge from them essentially unchanged, carrying the same patterns that led to the difficulty in the first place, and typically encountering the same patterns again in a different form. The person who maintains some form of contact with the interior dimension of the experience, who can ask not just, how do I get out of this, but what is this asking of me? What is this showing me? What in me is this connected to? That person is participating in something different. They are, often without knowing it, cooperating with their own individuation. And here is what makes the Jungian framework so disorienting to encounter in the middle of the hard years. The years that cost the most are frequently the years that are building the most. Not visibly, not in ways that show up in your circumstances or your bank account or your relationships in real time. The construction is happening at a deeper level, in the structure of the psyche itself, in the development of capacities that couldn't have been developed any other way, in the integration of material that the easier years allowed you to keep comfortably at a distance. You cannot see this while it is happening. The process is essentially invisible from the inside. What you can see is the cost. What Jung's framework makes visible is what the cost is for. To understand why the hard years are psychologically necessary, not just circumstantially unavoidable, but structurally required, you have to understand a concept Jung borrowed from the ancient Greek philosophers and built into the center of his psychological framework. He called it enantiodromia, the tendency of any extreme position, held long enough and with enough one-sidedness, to flip into its opposite with a force proportional to how long the original extreme was sustained. Jung described this not as a metaphor or an observation about social trends, but as a fundamental law of psychic equilibrium, the same self-regulating principle that governs physical systems applied to the architecture of the human mind. What it means in practice is this: the longer a particular orientation dominates, a particular identity, a particular set of priorities, a particular way of being in the world, the more the suppressed opposite accumulates pressure in the unconscious. And when the threshold is reached, the reversal happens, not gradually, with force. Most people experience this as catastrophe when it arrives. The life they built stops working. The identity they maintained becomes unsustainable. The future they planned becomes unavailable. And from inside the experience, it feels like failure, like something went wrong, like they made the wrong choices, like they are paying for mistakes. What Jung's framework reveals is a different reading of the same events. The collapse is not punishment. It is enantiodromia, the psyche's self-regulatory mechanism reaching a threshold and initiating the reversal that was always going to come, because the previous orientation was too one-sided to be indefinitely sustainable. The hard years are not evidence that you went in the wrong direction. They are frequently evidence that you went so far in one direction that the opposite, which contains everything your life was missing, is finally being brought into play. Jung found a concept in the medieval alchemical texts that he believed described this psychological process with more precision than any modern psychological vocabulary available to him. The alchemists called it the nigredo, literally, the blackening. It was the first and most necessary stage of the alchemical work, the stage in which the prima materia, the raw material, was broken down, dissolved, and reduced to its most elemental form. The alchemists didn't see this as a failure of the process. They saw it as the indispensable precondition for everything that followed. Without genuine dissolution, there could be no genuine transformation. Only superficial rearrangement of the same elements in a different configuration. Jung recognized in this the precise structure of what happened psychologically when a person was genuinely transformed rather than merely rehabilitated. Something had to dissolve that had previously seemed solid. A structure had to come apart that had previously seemed permanent. The nigredo was not the problem, it was the beginning of the solution. The reason the nigredo, the dark phase, the years that cost everything, cannot be skipped or circumvented, is something Jung was clinically precise about, even if it is deeply inconvenient. The psychological transformation that the hard years make possible depends entirely on the dissolution being genuine. When people attempt to resolve the hard years too quickly, to rebuild the previous structure faster, to restore the lost stability through effort and willpower, to find a new version of the old identity rather than allowing the old identity to be actually dissolved. What they typically produce is what Jung called psychological inflation, a rebuilt structure that has the appearance of stability but lacks genuine roots, because the roots require the dissolution to go all the way through. This is why some people emerge from difficulty and transform, while others emerge and repeat. The difference is frequently not effort or intelligence, but whether the dissolution was allowed to be complete or was interrupted before the deeper material could surface and be integrated. At a certain depth in the framework Jung developed, what is doing the pressing during the hard years is not random misfortune or your own mistakes or the malevolence of others, though all of those may be present and real. What is doing the pressing at the deepest level of the psychic architecture is the self, the archetype of totality and wholeness that functions as the deeper organizing center of the entire psyche. The self presses consistently through the structure of a person's life toward the fullest possible expression of who that person actually is. When the conscious direction of a life is aligned with the self's movement, things tend to have a quality of rightness even through difficulty. When the conscious direction is misaligned, when the persona, the social identity, the ego's plan for life is moving away from rather than toward the deeper center, the self uses the disruption of the misaligned structure to create the conditions for realignment. The hard years are frequently this, the self dismantling what was built in the wrong direction so that something built in the right direction can begin. If you're recognizing the shape of your own experience in this framework, write in the comments, "I trust the process," because naming what's happening with precision is different from simply enduring it, and that difference matters. One of the most important and least discussed indicators that the hard years are individuation in process, rather than simply misfortune, is the specific quality of what they are asking you to confront. Jung observed that the difficulty which produces transformation always has an interior dimension that corresponds to its exterior form, that the external challenges a person faces during their hardest years are consistently, almost eerily, precise in their relationship to the specific psychological material that person most needs to integrate. The relationship that falls apart is the one that was organized around exactly the illusion that most needed dissolving. The career that fails is the one that was built on exactly the false self most urgently needing to be outgrown. The loss that arrives is of exactly the thing that was substituting for the depth that was missing. This is not always visible in real time, but looking back from the other side, it almost always becomes visible. And the precision of the correspondence is one of the things that makes the Jungian framework so useful for making sense of the hard years in retrospect, if not always in the middle of them. The dissolution that happens during the hard years frequently targets the identity, the sense of self that was organized around particular roles, achievements, relationships, or capacities. This can feel like dying, and Jung did not minimize that. The loss of a known self is experienced by the psyche as a form of death, and the grief it generates is real. But in the Jungian framework, what is dissolving is not the person. It is a version of the person, a construction of self that was assembled often in childhood or early adulthood in response to the demands and wounds and compensations of a particular history. This constructed self is not false in the sense of being dishonest, but it is incomplete. It is a version of you that was built with the materials available at the time, under the conditions that existed, in response to what was needed then. The hard years, when they force the dissolution of this construction, are not destroying you. They are creating the conditions in which something more complete, more genuinely who you are, can take its place. The pain of the hard years is proportional in the Jungian framework to the degree of misalignment between the conscious life and the deeper self. This is a difficult thing to sit with because it can be misread as blame, as the suggestion that the harder your years have been, the more wrong you were doing. That is not what Jung meant, and it is important to be precise. The misalignment he described was not a moral failing. It was a natural consequence of having been formed by circumstances that required a particular configuration of self. one that served its purpose for a time, that was genuinely the best available response to what was needed, but that eventually became too narrow to contain what the self was pressing toward. The pain of the hard years is not punishment for the misalignment. It is the energetic cost of the realignment. And the greater the distance between where you were and where you need to be, the greater the cost of that journey. The shadow plays a specific and often uncomfortable role in the hard years that Jung spent considerable clinical attention documenting. The shadow, in his framework, is the repository of everything the conscious personality has refused to acknowledge or integrate. The qualities, impulses, capacities and potentials that didn't fit the identity being maintained. During the comfortable years, the shadow stays mostly manageable. There is enough structure, enough busyness, enough momentum in the existing life to keep the shadow's contents at a distance. The hard years remove that structure. They remove the busyness, they remove the momentum, and in the space that opens up, sometimes terrifyingly, sometimes unexpectedly, the shadow material surfaces. What was being carefully avoided becomes unavoidable. What was being managed at a comfortable distance moves into the foreground. This is not additional misfortune layered on top of the primary difficulty. This is the shadow integration that the hard years are designed at the deepest level to initiate. The distinction between shadow integration that happens through crisis, forced by the hard years, and shadow integration that happens through deliberate inner work matters in a specific way that Jung was careful to articulate. When crisis forces the shadow to the surface, the material that emerges is real, and the opportunity for integration is genuine. But the integration isn't automatic. The shadow surfacing is not the same as the shadow being integrated. What determines whether the forced encounter with the shadow during the hard years produces transformation or simply adds to the damage is the quality of the engagement with what surfaces. The person who uses the hard years to carefully avoid what is being surfaced, who treats the emerging shadow material as additional problems to be solved rather than as information to be received, will typically not integrate it. They will manage it back down, rebuild the structure that kept it contained, and carry it forward unchanged. The person who turns toward what is surfacing with honesty and some degree of willingness to look directly at it is engaging in the shadow integration that makes genuine transformation possible. Jung wrote with remarkable precision about what he called the moment of greatest darkness, the point in the process where the old structure has dissolved far enough that it cannot be rebuilt, but the new structure has not yet emerged enough to be visible. This is frequently the most acute period of the hard years, the threshold between the dissolution and the emergence, where nothing seems to be working, and there is no evidence that anything will. In the alchemical framework he was drawing on, this was the depth of the nigredo, the point where the prima materia was most completely dissolved, most apparently reduced to nothing useful. And it was precisely at this point, the alchemists understood, that the work was most advanced, not because anything visible had been achieved, but because the dissolution was complete enough that the emergence could finally begin. Recognizing the depth of the darkness as a potential indicator of how far the process has come, rather than only as evidence of how bad things are, doesn't eliminate the pain. But it changes the relationship to it in ways that matter. One of the most counterintuitive dimensions of the Jungian framework is the concept of what might be called invisible accumulation. The building that occurs during the hard years at a level of the psyche that is not accessible to ordinary consciousness. The hard years feel like only subtraction of stability, of certainty, of the future that was planned, of the person that was known. What is invisible is the simultaneous addition, the development of psychological capacities that could not have been developed any other way, the capacity to sustain uncertainty without being destroyed by it, the capacity to lose the known self and discover that something remains, the capacity to feel the full weight of difficulty without collapsing under it, the capacity for a quality of empathy and understanding that only direct experience of real darkness produces. None of these show up on any visible ledger during the process. They are being built in the interior, in the structure of the psyche itself, against the day when they will be needed. And when the recompense that the hard years generate finally becomes visible, it arrives already loaded with these capacities. The reason the reward that follows the hardest years so consistently feels larger than what was imagined, the specific quality of surprise that people describe when they look back from the other side, is that the imagination of the reward is constrained by the psychology of the person doing the imagining. What you can imagine receiving is limited by who you are when you imagine it. The reward that arrives after the hard years is typically received by a different person, one whose capacity to recognize value, to hold depth, to sustain what is being offered, has been developed precisely by the years that seem to be only costing. The surprise is not that the reward is larger than expected. It is that the person who arrives to receive it is larger than the person who entered the hard years. And that larger person can receive, hold, and use what the smaller person could never have managed, even if they had received it. The transcendent function is one of Jung's most precise and most underappreciated concepts, and it is the central mechanism by which the hard years convert into the reward that follows them. Jung described it as the psyche's innate capacity to generate something genuinely new, not a compromise between existing positions, not a return to a previous state, not the better of two available options, but an emergent third thing that neither side of the tension could have produced alone. It operates through the sustained holding of opposites. When two apparently irreconcilable realities are held in genuine tension, not escaped, not resolved prematurely, not collapsed into one side or the other, the psyche eventually generates something new from the contact between them. What the hard years do, structurally, is force this holding. They remove the escape routes. They make premature resolution unavailable. And in doing so, they create the precise conditions under which the transcendent function can actually operate. What is required for the transcendent function to work, what the hard years are building whether the person knows it or not, is the capacity to sustain tension without resolution. This is not natural. The psyche instinctively seeks relief. It seeks the side of the contradiction that feels safer, clearer, more defensible. It seeks the resolution that stops the discomfort, even if the resolution is premature, even if it forecloses something important. The hard years, by making premature resolution genuinely unavailable, by forcing the person to live in the tension between what was and what might become, between who they were and who they are not yet, are building exactly the psychological muscle that the transcendent function requires. Every day you survive in genuine uncertainty, holding what you cannot yet resolve. You are developing a capacity that most people never develop because their circumstances never demanded it. That capacity is not a side effect of the hard years. It is one of their primary products. The reward that the Jungian framework describes as emerging from the hardest years is not what most people imagine when they think about reward. It is not a restoration of what was lost, not the return of what was taken, not the arrival of the future that was planned before everything fell apart. In Jung's understanding, that kind of reward, restoration, compensation, getting back to where you were, is typically a much smaller outcome than what the hard years have actually made possible. The transcendent function, when it operates through a process of genuine dissolution and sustained tension, produces something that the previous life could not have generated, even if everything had gone smoothly. It produces access to a level of psychological depth, relational authenticity, creative capacity, and inner authority that is structurally unavailable to people whose development has not passed through genuine difficulty. This is why the reward feels larger than imagined, because the imagination was formed by the previous self, and what arrives belongs to a different, larger self. The archetype that most directly captures the psychological mechanism behind the hard years converting into reward is what Jung called the wounded healer, a pattern he found across cultures, clinical cases, and historical figures. The wounded healer is the person whose capacity to accompany others in difficulty flows directly and specifically from their own experience of it, not from their training, not from their intelligence, not from their good intentions, from the specific territory they have personally inhabited. The credential is not academic, it is experiential, and in the Jungian framework, this is not limited to literal healing professions. It is a principle about how the deepest human capacities develop, the quality of presence, of understanding, of relational depth, of creative authority that distinguishes the people whose contributions matter most from those who are merely competent. This quality emerges consistently and almost exclusively from the experience of having been in genuine difficulty and found the way through. The hard years are building this credential. Whether it is eventually expressed in a profession, a relationship, a creative body of work, or simply in the quality of a life, the credential is real, and it is being built now. The relationship between the depth of the difficulty and the quality of what can emerge from it is not a simple proportional calculation. More suffering doesn't mechanically produce more capacity. But there is a consistency in the Jungian framework that Jung documented clinically across hundreds of cases. The people who ultimately develop the most significant psychological depth, the most genuine relational capacity, the most authentic and impactful presence in the world, were almost never the people who had passed through life without significant difficulty. They were the people who had passed through difficulty and, whether through deliberate inner work or through some quality of honest engagement with their experience, had not left the hard years empty-handed. They had integrated something, not the comfortable lesson that everything happens for a reason in a superficial sense, but the specific, hard-won psychological material that only genuine dissolution and genuine reconstitution can produce. And here's what changes when the psyche genuinely passes through an individuating process, rather than simply surviving a difficult period. The quality of the relationship to your own experience shifts fundamentally and permanently. Before genuine individuating difficulty, most people relate to their interior life, their emotions, their fears, their desires, their sense of meaning, primarily through the lens of what the established identity allows them to see. The blind spots are invisible because the identity is intact, and the identity is doing the not seeing. After genuine dissolution and reconstitution, the relationship to the interior changes. You can see around corners that were previously invisible. You have access to parts of yourself that were previously outside the range of the known self. You encounter your own shadow material not as foreign and frightening, but as familiar, as things you have already met in the dark and learned to sit with. This changed relationship to the interior is not a mood or a feeling. It is a structural change in the architecture of the psyche, and it is the most durable form of the reward. The ego self-axis, the living connection between the conscious personality and the deeper organizing center of the psyche, is built, in Jung's framework, primarily through difficulty. Not exclusively, but primarily. During the easy years, the ego tends to operate largely independently of the self, making its plans, pursuing its objectives, organizing life around its preferences, with only occasional visitations from the deeper center in the form of dreams or synchronicities or persistent feelings that something important is not being attended to. The hard years interrupt this independence. They force the ego into a position where its own resources are genuinely insufficient, where no amount of willpower, intelligence, strategy, or effort can resolve what is being faced. And in that insufficiency, something different becomes available. The possibility of contact with the deeper center, the self, whose resources are not exhausted by the difficulty because they don't depend on the circumstances being favorable. The ego-self axis is built in precisely this contact. And the strength of that axis, the reliability of that connection, the capacity to access the deeper center under conditions of genuine pressure, is one of the most significant things the hard years can produce. If this framework is giving you a new way to understand what you've been living through, let me know by liking this video. This work matters, and your engagement tells me it's reaching the people who need it most. People who have not passed through substantial difficulty, who have moved through their lives in comfortable trajectories, accumulating achievements without significant disruption, frequently hit a wall at the point where their existing psychological capacities become insufficient for what they are trying to do or become. The wall can appear in midlife, or in the first genuinely serious relationship, or in the first genuinely high-stakes, creative or professional challenge, or in the first serious encounter with loss. And at that wall, they discover that they don't have the interior resources that the situation requires, not because they are inadequate human beings, but because those resources are developed through a specific kind of experience that their lives have not demanded. The hard years in the Jungian framework are building exactly those resources, not in spite of how much they cost, because of how much they cost. Jung described the specific quality that emerges from genuine individuating difficulty as psychological authority, a quality that is distinct from confidence, from expertise, from social position, from earned credentials. Psychological authority is the capacity to speak and act from a depth that others can feel without being able to articulate why they feel it. It is what makes certain people's presence in a room change the quality of what is possible. It is what makes certain people's engagement with a problem or a relationship or a creative challenge arrive with a weight that other people's engagement lacks, even when the surface competence is comparable. This quality cannot be performed. It cannot be educated into a person. It is the product of having been somewhere genuine, having encountered something real, having passed through a process that most people do not pass through, and having emerged not unscathed, but transformed. The hard years are building this. It is not visible now, but it will be visible in every room you enter for the rest of your life. The timing of the reward, the question of why it doesn't arrive during the hard years, but in the period that follows them, is explained in the Jungian framework through the logic of the transcendent function's operation. The new thing that the transcendent function generates cannot emerge while the tension is still at its maximum, while the dissolution is still in process, while the old structure is still in the active phases of coming apart. The emergence happens in the space that opens after the dissolution, when the pressure has converted into something different. This is one of the reasons the reward so consistently seems to arrive suddenly, not because it was absent before and suddenly appeared, but because it was building through the process and became visible in the moment the conditions for its visibility were finally present. The process was always the preparation. The outcome was always being constructed inside it. What changes is not the trajectory, but your capacity to see where you have arrived. The case of someone who spent 3 years losing everything, a business, a marriage, a professional identity they had built across a decade, illustrates the pattern with unusual clarity. From the outside, it looked like simple failure compounding on failure. From the inside, it felt like evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with the person. What was actually happening in the Jungian framework was a precise and necessary dissolution of an identity structure that had been organized around external achievement and external validation in a way that had nothing underneath it. The hard years removed the structure, not to leave nothing, but to expose what the structure had been substituting for. A genuine relationship to the interior, a genuine sense of what mattered independent of what it produced, a genuine capacity for depth that the achievement-organized life had been bypassing. What emerged on the other side was not a rebuilt version of the previous identity. It was something qualitatively different, a person who had been somewhere real and could bring that realness into everything they subsequently touched. The reward that followed was not compensation for the loss. It was the product of the transformation the loss had initiated. There are specific indicators that the Jungian framework identifies as signals that the psyche is moving out of the dissolution phase and into the emergence phase, that the nigredo is giving way to what the alchemists called the albedo, the whitening, the first signs of the new form becoming visible. These are not signs that everything is better. They are signs that the process has advanced to a particular stage, and recognizing them correctly changes the relationship to the experience in ways that matter. The first and most fundamental is a shift in the quality of the pain itself. During the deepest phase of the dissolution, the pain tends to have a disorienting, formless quality, the sense that the ground itself is gone, that there is no stable reference point, that each day brings new losses in new forms with no discernible pattern. The shift that signals the emergence phase is subtle but distinct. The pain begins to have shape. It becomes possible to locate it, to name it, to feel its specific texture, rather than simply being inside a general environment of loss. The pain hasn't ended, but it has become something more workable, more differentiated, more like grief than like drowning. The increase of synchronicities, the meaningful coincidences that Jung wrote about extensively, is one of the most consistently reported experiences as the hard years begin to turn. In the Jungian framework, synchronicities are the signature of alignment between the individual psyche and the deeper movement of the collective unconscious. They increase when the interior work is advancing, when the process of individuation is in an active phase, when the psyche is in particularly direct communication with the deeper layers that structure experience. People describe, as the hard years begin to shift, a sudden increase in the sense that things are happening for reasons, that encounters, discoveries, and opportunities are arriving with a quality of meaning that earlier, darker periods lacked. This is not wishful thinking in the Jungian framework. It is a clinical indicator that the alignment between the individual psyche and the self's movement has increased. The universe has not changed. The receiver has. Dreams are one of the most reliable indicators in the Jungian framework of where the psyche actually is in a process, not where it thinks it is, not where the conscious mind narrates it to be, but where the unconscious is actually operating. During the deepest phases of the hard years, dreams tend to carry a specific signature, themes of pursuit, collapse, being trapped, being lost in unfamiliar territory, encountering figures of menace or overwhelming power. These are the unconscious's representations of the nigredo in process, the dissolution being experienced in the interior. As the emergence phase approaches, the dream landscape shifts with a consistency that Jung documented clinically. The landscapes become navigable. The figures of menace begin to transform into something that can be engaged with, spoken to, learned from. Discoveries appear, rooms in houses that were previously inaccessible, landscapes that open rather than entrap, objects or figures that carry significance. The dream, in the Jungian reading, is not predicting the future. It is reporting on the current state of the interior, and the shift in its imagery is a report on genuine interior progress. One of the most psychologically significant shifts that occurs as the hard years move toward their resolution, and one that is frequently missed because it comes dressed in a form that can look like further loss, is what might be called the clarity of what is not returning. There comes a point in the process where certain things that were lost become clearly, finally, not coming back, not as a catastrophic conclusion, but as a settled recognition. The relationship is not being rebuilt. The version of the career that existed before is not being restored. The future that was planned before the hard years began is not the one that is being moved toward. And in the Jungian framework, when this recognition arrives with peace rather than panic, with a quality of completion rather than defeat, it is one of the clearest signals that integration has occurred. The psyche has processed the loss at a level deeper than the ego's acceptance. The material has been metabolized, and the liberation that follows the release of what was never going to return creates space, interior space, for what the process was building toward. The capacity to hold contradiction without collapsing it, to sustain ambivalence, to remain genuinely present to both the grief of what was lost and the possibility of what might emerge without needing to resolve the tension by eliminating one pole. This capacity is both a sign that the transcendent function has been activated and a condition that the emergence phase requires. During the hard years, most people's capacity for this oscillates dramatically. Some days, the grief dominates entirely, and the possibility seems delusional. Other days, the sense of possibility surges, and the grief temporarily recedes. As the emergence phase approaches, something different starts to become possible, genuine simultaneity. The grief and the possibility begin to coexist, each real, neither cancelling the other. In the Jungian framework, this is not a psychological achievement in the self-congratulatory sense. It is a structural sign that the transcendent function is operating at a level where it can actually generate the emergent third thing, the new orientation, the new self, the new life that the dissolution was preparing for. The sixth sign, and one of the most counterintuitive, concerns the quality of relationships that begin to appear or deepen as the emergence phase approaches. Jung's understanding of how the unconscious communicates through the external world, specifically through synchronicities and through what is sometimes called the law of resonance, the idea that what we carry internally tends to attract what corresponds to it externally, predicts a specific pattern. As the interior work advances, the quality of what appears externally shifts. This is not magical thinking. It is a psychological observation about how a person operating from a different interior position tends to encounter different things. Not because the world has changed, but because what is perceived, responded to, and made available to is shaped by the state of the perceiver. People begin to appear who operate at a depth that previously encountered strangers didn't. Opportunities surface that weren't legible before. The same world that previously felt entirely closed begins to show openings. This shift in the quality of what appears is not the reward itself. It is the announcement that the reward's arrival is becoming possible. The seventh signal is in some ways the most important and the most subtle. When the hard years begin to make sense retrospectively, when it becomes possible to trace the logic of why exactly those specific difficulties with exactly that specific content arrived in exactly that sequence, without the circumstances having significantly changed. Nothing external is yet different, but the interior has reorganized to the point where the pattern becomes visible. And this visibility is not the product of a story you are telling yourself to feel better. It has a specific quality that distinguishes it from rationalization. It arrives with recognition rather than with effort. You are not constructing the meaning, you are perceiving it, as if a pattern that was always there has finally come into focus. In the Jungian framework, this is the self-knowledge that the individuation process was building, and its arrival is one of the most reliable indicators that the process is approaching completion. If the shape of your own experience is appearing in these signs, and you feel like the missing piece is practical, the specific work, the specific next steps for someone at exactly this stage. I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready for that level of specificity. The most fundamental distinction in how to cooperate with the process of the hard years, the one that determines more than any other single factor whether the years produce transformation or simply endurance, is the distinction between passive suffering and conscious participation. Jung was very clear about this. Suffering in itself does not produce psychological development. People suffer for years and emerge unchanged, carrying the same patterns forward into new circumstances where they generate the same outcomes. What produces development is the quality of engagement with the interior dimension of the suffering. The willingness to ask not just when does this end, but what is this showing me? What in me is this connected to? What is this asking me to become? This shift from passive endurance to conscious participation is not a mood. It is not optimism. It is a specific interior orientation that can be chosen and maintained even in the depths of the hardest phases. The first practical element of conscious cooperation with the process is what Jung called maintaining relationship with the inner world, refusing to let the outer demands of managing difficulty completely evacuate the interior. During the hard years, there is a constant pull toward pure outer-directed functioning, survival mode, problem-solving mode, endurance mode. These are necessary and real. But if they are exclusive, if every resource and every moment of attention goes outward and nothing goes inward, the psychic processing that converts difficulty into development doesn't happen. Something has to be kept aside for the interior, some consistent engagement with dreams, with the images and feelings that arise in quiet moments, with the sense of what is trying to happen underneath the surface of the management. This doesn't require hours. It requires intention, the consistent choice to keep one ear turned toward the interior, even when the exterior is demanding everything. The second element of conscious cooperation is shadow engagement, turning toward what the hard years are bringing to the surface rather than managing it back down. This is the most uncomfortable recommendation in the Jungian framework, because it is the most counter-instinctive when something disturbing surfaces, an anger you didn't know you were carrying, a fear that seems larger than the situation warrants, a desire or an impulse that doesn't fit the self-image. The instinct is to minimize it, to explain it away, to find the most efficient route back to psychological stability. But in the Jungian understanding, those surfacing contents are precisely the material that the hard years were designed to bring forward for integration. Turning toward them, with curiosity rather than only with alarm, with a willingness to look directly rather than peripheral management, is the core of what makes the hard years produce transformation rather than mere endurance. The deepest truth that Jung's framework offers about the hard years is this: the years that have cost the most are producing the version of you that is most capable of receiving and using what is coming, not despite what they have taken, because of it. The dissolution of the previous identity, the confrontation with the shadow material that the comfortable years kept at a distance, the sustained tension between what was and what might become, all of it has been building something that the previous self could not have held, could not have received, could not have sustained. The reward is not arriving for a smaller person. It is arriving for someone who has been made, through precisely this process, large enough to receive it. The reason the reward that follows the hardest years so consistently exceeds what was imagined is not that life compensates for suffering. The Jungian framework makes no such promise, and any honest accounting of human experience would reject it. The reason is more precise and more significant. What the hard years produce, when they are engaged with, rather than simply endured, is a fundamental expansion of psychological capacity, the capacity to perceive depth, to sustain complexity, to hold what matters without being destroyed by its weight. The reward feels larger than imagined because the person who imagined it was smaller than the person who receives it. What was built in the interior of the hard years is the upgrade to the receiver. And a more capable receiver receives more. Jung was precise about something that is easy to miss in the optimism of anticipating the reward. The process of individuation cannot be accelerated, but it can absolutely be sabotaged. And the most common form of sabotage is not dramatic. It does not look like giving up or collapsing. It looks like reaching for premature closure, rebuilding the old structure before the dissolution is complete, choosing the interpretation of events that stops the discomfort fastest rather than the one that is most honest, returning to the known self before the unknown self has had time to emerge. The timing of the reward is not arbitrary. It corresponds to the completion of the interior work. Sabotaging that work by interrupting it prematurely is how people spend years in difficulty and emerge without the transformation the difficulty was building. The process asks for completion, not just endurance. There is a quality of congruence that begins to develop in the Jungian framework between the state of the interior and the character of what appears in the exterior. Not as magic, not as cosmic reward, but as a natural consequence of the shift in what a changed person perceives, gravitates toward, and makes available to. The law of resonance that Jung described is not a metaphysical claim. It is a psychological observation that who we are at the deepest levels of the psyche shapes what we can recognize, respond to, and invite into our lives. As the interior work of the hard years reaches completion, the exterior world does not change, but the range of what becomes possible within it expands in precise correspondence with the depth of the interior change. This is not the world opening. This is you becoming someone for whom different doors are legible. What it means to have passed through this, not merely to have survived it, but to have participated in it, even imperfectly, even without fully understanding what was happening, is something the Jungian framework addresses with unusual directness. It means you have been somewhere real. It means the authority you carry in every room you subsequently enter is not borrowed, not performed, not constructed from credentials. It is earned at the deepest level at which earning happens, in the interior, in the structure of the psyche itself. Other people can feel this quality without being able to name it. It is present in the quality of your listening, the quality of your presence in difficulty, the quality of your engagement with what matters. It does not announce itself. It simply is. And it is permanent in a way that circumstances cannot take back. What is required now, from the place where you are, at whatever point in the process you find yourself, is something simpler than strategy and more demanding than effort. It is a quality of honest presence to what is actually happening in the interior, a willingness to keep looking at what is being shown rather than at what is more comfortable to see, to keep one ear consistently turned toward the interior, even when the exterior is demanding everything, to let the meaning that is trying to emerge actually emerge rather than substituting a more convenient meaning in its place. Jung described this not as a heroic act, but as a consistent orientation, a daily choosing of contact with what is real over management of what is uncomfortable. It is not dramatic, but sustained over time. It is the single most consequential choice available to you in the middle of the hard years. The hardest years of a life are not, in Jung's framework, the opposite of the reward that follows them. They are its origin. They are the specific process through which the psyche generates the capacities, the depth, the interior authority, and the quality of presence that constitute the most significant form of reward, the kind that is not vulnerable to circumstance, not dependent on external conditions remaining favorable, not diminished by the inevitable difficulties that follow. What you carry out of the hard years, if you have engaged with them honestly, is not a scar. It is a credential. Not in the sense of something you display, but in the sense of something you simply are. Something that changes the quality of everything you touch from that point forward. The hard years were not an interruption of the life you were meant to have. They were, in the most precise sense available to psychology, its construction. If you stayed with this until the end, write in the comments, "I trust the process." That phrase carries more precision than it might seem. And naming what's happening changes the relationship to it in ways that matter. I've placed another lesson on your screen right now that continues exactly where this one ends. The next piece is already waiting.